Welcome, everyone. We'll begin shortly. Please share in the chat where you're joining us from this evening. Hello in Indiana, Iowa City. Oh my goodness. Uh, Welcome, Richmond, Virginia, Pittsburgh. Hello, Los Angeles. A lot of folks in Iowa City, Vermont, San Antonio, Texas. These are coming in faster than I can read them. Kansas City, Brooklyn. Hello, Monica. Williamton, North Carolina, Ithaca, New York, New York City, Connecticut, Taos, New Mexico, St. Petersburg, Florida, Long Island, Chicago, Toronto, our first international. Hello, Canada. We have a friend in transit in Northern and Southern California, San Francisco, Detroit, Michigan. Hello. Portland, Oregon. Hello in Boston, rural San Diego. We'll begin in just a few minutes, letting more folks join us. Hello, Daytona Beach, Florida, Pittsburgh. Hello, Boulder, Colorado, Rockville, Winston-Salem, Myrtle Beach. Hello, welcome. If you're just joining us, feel free to share where you're joining from. More folks in Brooklyn, Dallas, Texas. Hello again, Portland, Oregon. Hello, Philadelphia. More San Antonio, Texas. In Queens. Hello, everyone. Good evening. I'm Janessa Abrams, a brunette woman of Caucasian descent in large glasses. I'm the director of narrative medicine rounds and a lecturer in the narrative medicine program. On behalf of the division, we'd like to thank everyone for joining us for our final narrative medicine rounds of the 2025-2026 season. For those of you returning, we're glad to be with you again. For those of you new to us, we're so happy to have you here. Narrative medicine is an interdisciplinary field grounded in the practice of close reading, reflective writing, and attentive listening. Our work is dedicated to transforming healthcare at both individual and structural levels. Each month, we invite world-renowned writers and clinicians into dialogue to explore how storytelling shapes our understanding of health, illness, and the systems that surround them. I would like to acknowledge that we are hosting tonight from Manhattan, part of the unceded ancestral and traditional homeland of the Lenni, Lenape, and Wappinger people. A few brief reminders before we introduce our wonderful moderator and speaker to ensure that our program goes smoothly. We've muted your microphones to cut down on background noise during the program. You'll need permission from a host if you need to unmute. Please note if there are any interruptions or inappropriate activity, you may be removed from the event. We'll pause the chat during the reading to preserve a shared space of attention. You can reach out to designated narrative medicine staff. That's myself and Kristen. Both of our names are tagged with narrative medicine if you need to find us, should you need any support. As we get closer to the audience Q&A, we will reopen the chat and invite you to submit questions for our speaker. So please save all questions to type into the chat after we make the announcement. Without further ado, I'm honored to welcome our moderator for tonight's conversation, Lily Dansinger, celebrated author of First Love, Essays on Friendship, a Lambda Literary Award finalist. Negative Space, winner of the Santa Fe Writers Project Literary Award, and Muscle Memory, forthcoming in 2027. We're thrilled to have Lily returning to us as a speaker for next year's rounds. Welcome, Lily.
Hi, thanks so much for inviting me to do this. I'm happy to be here. I'm excited to be in conversation with Melissa. So I guess let's see, this is where I now introduce Melissa, who will talk for a bit and then we'll chat. I get to ask some questions. Melissa Febos is the national best-selling author of 5 books, including Girlhood, Bodywork, The Radical Power of Personal Narrative, and The Dry Season, which I'm going to ask about today. She's the recipient of awards and fellowships from the National Book Critics Circle, the Guggenheim Foundation, the National Endowments for the Arts, and others. Her work has appeared in the Paris Review, the New Yorker, the Best American Essays, and others, many others. And she's a professor at the University of Iowa. Hi, Melissa. Welcome.
Hi, Lily. It's so good to see you. Thanks
Me
for doing
too.
this with me.
My pleasure.
Yeah, I'm so glad to be here. Thank you, Janessa, and everyone who has a part in putting this series on. It's so important, ever more important, I think. It's funny, as I was, hold on, let me just set my little timer so I don't talk for too long. I'm going to talk just a little bit and then I'm going to read for some, and then Lily and I will talk, which will be my favorite part, and also talking with all of you. That's my favorite part of events like this. But I just finished reading my mother's book. My mother just wrote a book. She's a psychotherapist who has a 30-year clinical practice, and she's really deep into IFS. And I'm sure this is one of those rooms where probably a lot of people have actually heard of IFS. It does seem to have hit sort of a tipping point in sort of public consciousness. But if you've heard people talk about parts work, they're talking about a psychotherapy model called internal family systems. And I won't break it all down for you right now, but my mom is a senior trainer in IFS. She's treated patients and trained therapists for many, many years in IFS. And she's specifically done her research around the application of IFS to people with chronic illness and physical health disorders and disease. And she piloted this research study at the Cambridge Hospital at Harvard. And anyway, amazing results. And she wrote this book for practitioners and for patients about how to sort of use IFS, which I think of as a form of narrative medicine, to treat sort of physical health disorders. And it's an incredibly moving book with like case studies. But as I was reading it, I was just thinking about how writing has been medicine for me, and the ways that what she was describing in that book, which is really about sort of the parts of us that get estranged from the whole when we undergo trauma, and how that can manifest somatically in any number of ways, all kinds of disease and illness, right? And for me as a patient in therapy, it's always been a process of integration, and that's what she's describing in the book. And for me, writing is also a process of integration, particularly nonfiction, which is sort of explicitly finding the parts of myself that I became estranged from during experience and bringing them back into the fold of my whole self, right? It's however so we can have sort of tough narratives about writing, right? As if writing is sort of working in a coal mine. But for me, despite its many challenges, writing is fundamentally a loving practice. It is a medicinal practice. It's a spiritual practice for me, and nothing has brought more healing to my life than writing, and particularly writing my experience and narrativizing my own memories and filling in those gaps and bringing back those parts of myself that were exiled during the living, for good reasons, for survival's sake, right? So I've like written and thought, and been grateful for that dynamic with my artistic practice for a really, really long time. And I like to say this is the UK version, which is my reading copy because it's smaller, so I could fit it in my suitcase on book tour. My publicist was really mad about that, but this is my happiest book. It's my only happy book. It is sort of, I like to say that I had to sort of dredge the lake for three books where I really was sort of doing that deep, elbow deep work of sort of finding the memories and experiences and truths about myself that I could not confront when I was younger, and sort of doing that work on the page in privacy and then sharing it with other people, which is like another level of healing for me. Um, and then I wrote a book about writing autobiographically, which, if you want to hear all my thoughts about the narrative medicine of writing memoir, it's all in there. But then I thought I would be done writing nonfiction, and then I wrote this book, which is interesting because it is, in one sense, the happiest book I've written. I was able to like bring my sense of humor to it, and it has a greater sense of irony than any of my other books, because there was a little more breathing room. But it's funny looking back at it because it was very much an integrative healing process, just like my other books. And the premise of it is basically that I was in sort of nonstop monogamous relationships from about the age of 15 until I was 35. Um, and, I'm the daughter of a psychotherapist. I had a really big emotional vocabulary. I went to couples therapy with lots of my partners. I thought I was really, really good at relationships. And then I had this relationship in my 30s that was so destructive and so just excoriating to every part of me in my life that at the end of it, I had no choice but to confront the fact that my narrative about myself and my actual experience and the impact I was having on other people were not aligned. And in fact, they were diverging seemingly farther and farther apart as I was getting older at that point. And so I had this period of reckoning. I was at sort of a reckoning point, and I decided to spend some time celibate. I didn't think it would be a year. I thought it would be a few months. I sort of framed it as a kind of wellness exercise at first. I was like, I'm going to get a haircut and clean out my closet and spend some quality time with myself. And then maybe I will have totally different relationship to intimacy. And that is, of course, not at all how personal transformation works, as I'm sure all of you know. I had to do some really, really deep digging. And what began as 3 months became a year, and this really exhaustive, incredibly profound experience where I sifted through every relationship that I had ever been in that could qualify as intimacy, and sort of performed a kind of autopsy on them, and really decided to look at who I had been rather than who I was telling myself I had been in those relationships. And, you know, it took me another 5 or 7 years to decide to write about it. I had no intention of writing about it. And I think I actually had to sort of live into the consequences of that time in order to understand the full impact on my life. Every memoir is, in some respect, a palimpsest, right? There is the time in which we describe, the time that we describe in our books, the time that we lived, and then there are all of the intervening years and conversations and therapy sessions and body healing that we do in between, so that we can come to a transparent understanding of what it meant. And sometimes that's a period of months. Sometimes it happens while we're living it. In this case, it was almost 10 years. And so I think I actually had to write this book from inside my marriage in order to really explain to you, well, what it meant to sort of forgo all forms of intimacy and do that deep sort of soul searching. And it truly changed the course of my life. So I thought I would just read a little bit from the beginning, a little bit from the middle, and a little bit from the end. A book about transforming oneself from the inside out can't really be summarized in a few paragraphs, but I'll just sort of dip you in so that you can get a sense of the range of how things changed. One of the last people I had sex with before I stopped having sex was a museum curator. She was going through a divorce and had the manic eyes of someone desperate to escape their current situation. In the Brooklyn lesbian tradition, we did not call our first date a date, but simply dinner, therefore maintaining the possibility that it was not a date, just a meal between potential friends until we decided whether or not we wanted it to be a date. We met at a wobbly table in a nice-ish restaurant in Williamsburg. She was beautiful in the candlelight, with high cheekbones and a shapely mouth, though our senses of humor seemed incompatible. She barely laughed at my jokes and didn't make many herself. As I sawed into my cauliflower steak, the biggest scam of all vegetarian entrees, though I kept optimistically ordering it in all the little restaurants of New York City that had discovered they could charge meat prices for a slab of fibrous water sprinkled with capers, she squinted at me. Is this a date? She asked. I shrugged. I don't know. Is it? I didn't mean for it to sound like a riddle, but it did. Things deteriorated further. She spoke about her ex-wife in a bereft, castigating tone, and I nodded non-committally. Still, she texted me the next day, and I did not hesitate to respond. We flirted all day, which was exponentially more fun over text than it had been in person, though our jokes did keep failing to land. I texted her while I ran on the treadmill at the gym, while my students wrote in class at red stoplights on the drive home, and while I brushed my teeth, spattering my sleep t-shirt with toothpaste as I smiled at my phone like a baby. I ignored the bored feeling I'd had in her presence, which had seemed reciprocal, and the way her grief had repelled me, an alarm I chose not to heed. Instead, I thought about her beautiful face and the way my body vibrated when my phone did with her messages. I found my jokes funny, and maybe that was enough. We kept this up, and a week later, I flew out of state for a reading. During the trip, our texts accelerated in a sexual direction. After I returned, we met up again, but skipped dinner this time, as if dinner had been the problem. Instead, I put on some Nina Simone, and we perched on my gray sofa drinking seltzer. 2 weeks of sexy text messages had not improved our rapport. We went to bed abruptly, as if that were the only way to end the conversation. Though I had stubbornly tried to prove otherwise, for me, sex without chemistry or love was a horror, and I felt quietly horrified as we lay together in my bed. None of the excitement of our text correspondences translated. We were strangers. Still, it seemed inexcusably rude to interrupt the interaction after all those texts. So I brought her to orgasm with my hand and then lay there for a few moments before slithering out of bed to go to the bathroom. Mercifully alone behind the closed bathroom door, I splashed cold water on my face and avoided the mirror. I considered how to get her out of my apartment without being a complete asshole. I considered the possibility that I was already an asshole. I spat into the sink and pressed my hands against my face as if I could smear it away and start over. Here I was, again. There wasn't anything extraordinary about my situation, except that I felt ready to do something about it. Well, almost ready. A few weeks later, I decided to spend 3 months celibate. You'll want to use some discernment when deciding who to talk to about this. I mean, making such a big deal out of 3 months of no sex, my mother, a therapist, cautioned me over the phone. You know, Mel, there are people who, I know, I said, of course I know that. Hang on, I'm about to run the blender. What's in your smoothie? She asked, but I didn't attempt to answer over the machine's roar. The problem with making a radical personal decision is that it pales in comparison to most things one would consider radical, like political revolution, religious conversion, suicide, or even divorce. A personal revolution is entirely subjective. Veganism, parenthood, sobriety, and yes, even 3 months of celibacy are attempts to induce a dramatic change in one's life, a fact they share with political revolution, but on a different scale. A shift can be radical and ordinary at the same time, or meaningless when removed from the context of a life. I didn't say any of this to my mother because it would have been patronizing and unnecessary. She's made many radical personal decisions, including living in a commune, escaping a cult, raising her baby, vegetarian in the 80s, 2 divorces, 1 religious conversion, and several dramatic career changes. She wasn't refuting my decision anyway, only pointing out the obvious with her usual unvarnished honesty. It had been she who most persistently recommended that I take a break in between relationships over the years, and she who knew better than most the reasons why I ought to. More relevant to our conversation was the feeling of pressure inside me that had been accumulating for years and accelerating over the past 6 months. We imagine the need for change manifesting in blatant ways because that's how it's represented in movies and memoirs and TV commercials. A eureka moment that requires little discernment. For me, and I think most people, it is less specific and more atmospheric, a recognition of the air quality rather than a strike of lightning. Perhaps there are some who recognize the first signs and change with haste, but I am not one. I cling to the habitual. I avoid inconvenient truth. I interrogate my intuition. I let the pressure build until the discomfort of staying the same grows greater than my discomfort with changing. When I was younger, that pressure took the shape of what I called free floating anxiety, as if anxiety were a weather system or an airborne disease that I had randomly encountered, rather than an internal response to my external life conditions, a result of my own choices. Anxiety, one therapist told me, is a secondary emotion, a response to emotion. Buddhists call this the second arrow. I don't know what Catholics call it, maybe guilt. Whatever I called it, it had returned, a cloud bank of fear that pressed dully over the whole sky. It was worst in the mornings. Since getting sober, I'd woken up happy most mornings, but now it took an hour to muster enough gumption to face the day. I was flinchy and tired and easily disgusted. My shoulders throbbed, tightened by anxiety's winch while I slept. I had nightmares so gruesome they felt rude to recount. I chewed my night guard to pieces. My back spasmed. I was clearly depressed, a state that makes me feel like an animal masquerading as a human in human clothes, because we are all that, and depression is more honest than happiness. I knew from experience that my depressions are usually situational. Drugs don't help, only change does. All of this to say, I felt feral and sad, and I couldn't explain it, but I knew that something had to change. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. At the time that this book takes place, I had been sober for almost 10 years, which was part of what sort of precipitated my understanding that I was in a crisis because I was definitely hitting bottom, completely losing myself, losing friends. My job was in danger and I hadn't relapsed, but something else was going on. And one of the animating questions of the book and one of the animating questions for me during that year of abstinence was how does sort of the rubric of this experience overlap with the rubric of addiction? You know, I identify as an addict. I've been clean and sober for 22 years now. And my experience in relationships, not just romantic relationships, but a lot of different kinds of relationships, but particularly intimate and romantic relationships, exhibited a lot of the symptoms of addiction, but in other ways it didn't. And, you know, a big part of what I end up describing here is sort of how to live inside of an experience that one might have an addictive or pathological response to without extracting it wholesale from one's life, right? And I think anyone who's in recovery from food addiction, people addiction, there's a lot of addictions to things that we also need to live with, right? Um, so anyway, this passage sort of comes out of that. When the maelstrom struck, that's the relationship that sort of got me to this place. And especially after it was over, I kept asking myself, how did this happen? How did I fall prey to such an obsession at 32 after all those years of therapy and sobriety? My inventory answered. It suggested that everything was always leading up to her and to this. I did not regret that ruination. I could see the debt of my current clarity to that bottom. The truth that there was no one else to blame. This drive in me had always been. It had made me an addict, this singular focus that had the power to overwhelm every other instinct, including that of survival. It would take me over a cliff and could turn anything into one. As a kid, the only time I was allowed to binge on television was Saturday morning cartoons. My favorites were Tex Avery's Droopy Dog and Sexy Red Hot Riding Hood, but of the better known characters, I had a soft spot for Wile E. Coyote. Coyote was the hapless protagonist of his skits, always trying to trap the smug roadrunner and always failing. Each of his Rube Goldberg contraptions backfired comically, and I found pathos in the grim resignation with which he opened his parasol as a boulder hurtled toward him. He was the rapacious predator, but also the underdog, the chump, the loser. Partly my sympathies were triggered because I rooted for the loser in every game, regardless of what team I claimed. I also related to Coyote. He looked like an absolute junkie, rangy and ragged, bloodshot eyes and greasy fur, strung out on his desire for Roadrunner. He was the hatcher of half-baked plans, a chronic underestimator, a real tweaker. Why didn't he eat something else? I understood why. Obsession made us stupid. Once that drive ignited, reason became a stranger. There was only hunger and new ways to chase it. I marveled at Coyote's ingenuity because I understood the relentless imagination of those whose perspective had narrowed straw thin. Coyote was a hungry ghost, dying over and over. Chuck Jones, who created the character for Warner Brothers in 1949, made him a sick and sorry looking skeleton based on Mark Twain's description of a coyote in his 1872 book of travel writing, Roughing It. Twain's coyote was a living, breathing allegory of want. He was always hungry. Once, walking laps around LA's Silver Lake Reservoir, I spotted a coyote jogging along the inside of the chain link that surrounded the water. He must have gotten in through a hole in the fence. Lean and haunted, he stared out at us passing humans like, how did I get into this hungry cage and how do I get out? I had to turn away. I once described myself as a gremlin to my therapist, but the figure of a coyote is more accurate. A gremlin was a monster, but Wile E. Coyote, though a kind of villain, was also a slave in bondage to his obsession. We associate villainy with power, but it is more often characterized by desperation. We are all capable of becoming predators if we get hungry enough. So, what I'm skipping over is, a spiritual awakening. Because I can't find one paragraph that describes a spiritual awakening. But basically, when I was sort of realized that I needed to actually take a more active role in my abstinence, I started looking for role models. And because I'm a nerd, I got a bunch of books and articles, and I started with all of the voluntarily celibate women I could find throughout history. So this included a lot of nuns, mystics, the Shakers, this amazing sect of religious women called the Belgian Beguines, who were basically living in like feminist collectives before we had a word for such things. Um, and I added to that sort of all of these artists and thinkers and philosophers and fuck ups who, um, at first sort of inspired me with their kind of self-actualized lives that were based on um, sort of divestment that brought them bodily and spiritual sovereignty. But then I started to add in people who sort of just suffered in the ways that I had suffered. A lot of people who were sort of mentally and physically chronically ill, artists who created through all of that strife. And so, in many ways, the book can also be described as sort of my discovering a lineage that I hadn't known I belonged to and one that I needed in order to change. Um, I'm not going to read any of those parts because there's a lot of research and it's hard to summarize. So I'm just going to read a little bit from the very end where it sort of describes the effect of all of that. And this comes right after I wrote this exhaustive inventory of everyone I'd ever loved, and I performed that sort of forensic autopsy on it. And then I sort of went through this ritual of confession where I read it to someone I call my spiritual director, a person I really trust, and received some really loving, honest feedback. And it was one of the first and deepest experiences of truly being seen in this part of my life. In the weeks that followed, something lifted. I felt it in my body, limbs bendy as birch switches, face flushed and open, pulse fizzing at my wrists. I sprang into each morning and ran through Prospect Park, its trees bright as struck matches, my heart pounding, elated, until I was drenched with sweat and soft-brained. I smiled at everyone, felt delighted by hot showers and dinners of cheese, green apple slices, and pickles. I felt in love as I only ever had toward other people. The trick of shame is that it only becomes visible once you set it down. I had thought I was yoked to the gravity of lovers when it was my own regret to which I was bound. Since my confession, a curtain had drawn back, the rooms of my life illuminated. I had thought their darkness inherent. I was reminded of Carl Jung's words: one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. How many times would I fumble through a dark room before I remembered to open the blinds? I could circle for years, groping the same corners without recognizing them until I was ready to face it. Avoidance could be the sharpest blade, and it could also be mercy, a kind of patience. Then another room, bright and finite. In the radiant room of my small apartment with its tall ceilings, I spent a whole weekend reading mysteries, chubby paperbacks that I held in front of my face while I boiled water and sat on the toilet. Oh, the joy of disappearing when there was nothing to run from, lounging in the middle of the day on the couch or the soft new rug, feet propped on a chair or the wall, absolutely gone. I had been reading myself into a trance since I was 5 years old, and for just as long marveling at the startled back to myself when the trance broke. The startling part was that for a few moments after I put the book down or looked up from its pages, there was no story, just a body in a room, soft rug under my legs, dust motes spinning in the buttery afternoon sunlight. I fell out of one story and drifted for a few vaporous moments before settling back into the story of myself. That's how it felt to wake up alone. I could be anyone or no one, just an animal with a past. Identity is a story other people tell us, that we learn to tell ourselves, that is housed inside relationships. It is a comfort to be known, to be anchored by these touchstones, and they can limit us. To live outside another person's story, the shared story of that relationship, revealed other possibilities, other truths. There was another kind of self that I had felt standing on the bank of the Rhine. That's when I went to visit the first abbey of Hildegard von Bingen, and that I felt during those drifting moments after reading and while writing. It reminded me of a poem by the Beguine mystic Hadovik. You who want knowledge, seek the oneness within. There you will find the clear mirror already waiting. And I'll stop there. Thanks so much for listening.
So beautiful. I love that section. It's nice to hear you read it.
Thanks, Lily.
Yeah, I'm excited to get to talk to you about this book. It's also fun. I read it like the minute I could get my hands on it when it came out, but I've been, spending time with it again, rereading, thinking of questions to ask you, and just really loving it all over again.
Thank you so much.
So let's see. All right, I have a million things I could ask you, but I've narrowed it down to a few, so we can leave time for other people to ask questions too. But one thing, you mentioned kind of the amount of research that's in here and this like kind of parallel pursuit that's happening while you're doing this deep personal work of also looking outward into the world for these new role models, and doing so much reading and like flying across the world to to go kind of follow in their footsteps. And there's this line early on in the book where you say, I often tried to substitute an emotional pursuit with an intellectual one. And this is kind of when you're introducing the fact that you're about to go on this big reading journey. But this book in particular, but also your work in general, I think strikes such a great balance of being like deeply embodied and personal and emotional, while also like indulging this urge, right, to process experience through research and theory and reading. And I thought it would be fun to hear you talk a little bit about
Yeah.
kind of how you see the relationship between those elements.
Yeah, happy to. And I'm curious what you have to say about it too, because I know we have a lot in common with our work habits and our reading
Yes.
habits.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny because when I talk to people for the first time, they're often like, "Oh, I think, aren't you just the kind of person who like loves therapy and is like fully present all the time and like understands all your feelings as though you're just like very in touch with yourself. And it's actually quite the opposite. I am by instinct a very dissociative person. I think, you know, a lot of people who are kind of addictive are, right? Like I just get overwhelmed really easily by my own feelings, by the world. Like it's not hard, but even, you know, when I was a little kid, I was just like, whoa, consciousness is a lot. I don't know if I'm up for it. And I found my routes out, right? And my primary route out, I was raised kind of by hippie parents and we didn't really have TV. And so reading was it for me. It might have been anyways, but I sometimes say that reading was my first drug of choice. And I mean that a bit more literally than most people would assume. Like I really read, you know, I would arrive at school with like hungover from reading all night with a flashlight under my covers, you know? And so for me, you know, as much as I sort of spoke at the beginning about how writing is a way of sort of coming back to myself, you know, in many respects, I think writing and my relationship to sort of research and thought is my most resilient quality. And that's why it's at the center of my life because it allows me to escape in a way that will inevitably bring me back to myself, you know? So if I had just been like, all right, I'm going to take a year and just confront my feelings, sort of exfoliate away all my self narratives and look at everything I did wrong. And ew, who wants to do that? I don't want to do that. I
Yeah.
mean, I had to do that. I think I
Yeah.
really did in order to sort of save my own life, again, in more literal terms than I think you would think. Um, but I was like, I need a mediator. I can't just, you know, I once had a therapist tell me to stop taking notes during our sessions. She was like, could you just like be here? And I was like, no, Jean, I
No.
can't.
Yeah.
I have to, I can only do this for the book and it will have the happy side effect of healing me, but I can't just do that for myself. It's too, I'm too squirmy. And so for me, it's like, in a way, I have yielded to that by being a writer. I'm like, all right, this
Hmm.
is just what I do. I will, uh, you know, I don't really feel like I choose my books. I feel like nonfiction kind of chose me. And I'm like, all right, I can yield to this as long as I can like be reading and thinking about other things for a lot of the time while I'm doing it. So I think very much as writing memoir and a research memoir, particularly as like setting off in a kind of labyrinth, right? And, you know, a labyrinth is distinct from a maze and that you know a maze has all the dead ends and stuff like that. A labyrinth is just a pathway that's unicursal, meaning it only has one pathway. It will
Hmm.
inevitably get you to exactly the same place every single time.
Hmm.
And for me, writing a book about myself is kind of a labyrinth. Like I know where I'm headed, but I'm going to go buy some really pretty hedges. I'm going to learn all about Hildegard von Bingen. I'm going to have fun conversations with my friends, and I'm just going to keep getting closer and closer and closer. So I will get to that sort of um, painful and liberating confrontation with the self, but I can't just do it all the time. You know, I need to be distracted. And for me, I think that's also kind of how I understand the aesthetic processes. Like,
Hmm.
I'm not afraid to say that writing memoir is therapeutic because it is, and because I understand, as I know you do, that the the art making process is a whole other part of it, right? I'm not
Yeah.
the therapeutic process isn't a substitute for that. They're completely different. You know, it's um, and so, you know, all the while I'm obsessed with making good art and making something beautiful and engaging and illuminating for another person, I'm still walking that labyrinth and getting closer and closer to myself.
Hmm.
Yeah, so it's a bit of a sort of self hack, I think.
So yeah, that's great. As a way to like kind of give yourself the shiny thing you want
Yeah,
and lead yourself along
yeah,
to where you need to
yeah. It's
go.
like habit bundling. Why I watch all my little TV shows on the treadmill on
Yes.
my iPad, right? It's kind of like that, but of a higher level.
Great. It's great. Yeah. So I mean, kind of some similar, related question too. You quote that the classic therapist question, like, but where do you feel it in your body, right? And yeah, and I
I know I've
laughed at
answered that
that.
question so many times. I'm always like,
Yeah.
no, don't make me.
Uh, yeah, and you say, you're like, I hate that question, and that's what I'm paying her for, right? Which I think you're right. This is your funniest book. Your humor comes through a lot, and I laughed at that moment in recognition, but also because that's something that you're so good at in your writing is locating the like intangible emotional experience of something into something so physical and tangible and therefore like legible, right? And you're like bringing us into the moment with you.
Yeah.
But I felt like that moment, in quoting that question and your immediate reaction to it was kind of an acknowledgement of the
Hmm.
work that it takes to get to those descriptions, right? And so
Yeah.
if that is not like the immediate
Yeah.
experience of it, right? And that doesn't
Yeah.
come naturally. What's the process by which you like
Hmm.
get back into the experience deeply enough to describe the physical aspect of
Yeah.
it?
Yeah. I think one of the reasons why I focus on embodiment so much in my work. I mean, one, it's because I know that that is the portal, right? That the
Mhm.
body is the portal narratively, and it is in identifying with the bodies of characters in work that we get to disappear and enter into the
Mm,
narrative and
mm,
have that beautiful sense of self-forgetting and sort of vicarious experience. And I that has meant so much to me as a reader that I want to give that to my readers. So it is very important for me to have like embodied work just on a craft level. But I also think, and just as importantly, it that's sort of the whole point for me, right? I
mm,
think ultimately that is the point. It's why I'm driven to write nonfiction, personal nonfiction, is because I have such a hard time with embodiment in my life, right? I think as soon as something gets scary or uncomfortable, I'm like, bye, body,
I,
see you later. um, and so I miss a lot. It's a very I'm like was a very sort of high functioning, somewhat dissociative child, very parentified kind of child. And I learned how to just leave my body when I needed to. And
mm,
I'm sure there's many people in this Zoom room who know how much work it takes to come back and to sort of undo those very precious survival mechanisms that are no longer serving us and are in fact inhibiting our ability to have intimacy with ourselves and with other people. And so for me, writing is one of the spaces where I have total privacy. I'm alone when I do it. Sometimes I think embodiment and intimacy with another person is not the first step. That's too scary. Even with a therapist, like I have often come back to my body first, or at least initiated that process alone where I feel safest. And
mm,
so, I'll be sitting at my desk, walking back through, like creating the diorama of past experience and really slowly sort of moving back through time and filling in the parts that are empty. Right. And
mm,
I think that creates a really vivid experience on the page, which is almost like the silhouette of the experience, right? It's everything that I couldn't feel when I was living it. So it has all of the shame and fear and sometimes joy, because you miss out on joy when you're just detached also.
mm.
Um, and so yeah, I think it's like I thought it was so funny. My craft book is called Body Work. And I was just like, when that I didn't come up with that title. That title was suggested to me. And when it was first suggested, I was like, ew. And I was like,
Yeah,
right, because my first surface reaction is still like, ah, don't traffic in
yeah.
there. But I mean, also like the last thing I'll say, because this has been a really long answer, is that the sort of one of the kind of shadow experiences of this book, and Bodywork, the book I wrote before it, was that I was going through really intense experience of chronic illness and like
Mm,
horrible back problems and sciatica, and was intermittently unable to walk, and did a lot of writing in like weird positions because I couldn't sit or stand. Um, and so I also think that I was going through a radical transformation in my relationship to my body then, because I think, and this is true for me, it's not true for everybody, but for me, my health problems and my chronic pain was in in large part due to my dissociation from my body and the
mm.
things I asked of my body and the ways that I overwhelmed my body's boundaries chronically for years, right? And my body was like, no more. You're done. You're 86. So I had to sort of rebuild that relationship in ways that I'll probably write about more in the future. But that is, I was talking about that palimpsest, and there's always like multiple stories sort of hidden inside of the memoir. And that's one of the ones that's hidden inside of this one.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that idea that it's like those embodied feelings that you put on the page. It's not even necessarily about like going back and accessing what you were feeling in the moment, but feeling what you were not able to feel in the moment. Yeah,
That's right.
that's beautiful. Um, let's see. Do I have time to ask one more? I'm looking at the clock
I can give
here.
you a short
Can I ask
answer
it? Yeah.
if you want to do one more.
Okay.
Limit
Um,
myself.
it's just something I was thinking about a lot when reading this book. Also having read Abandon Me when it came out and loved it, was how you're able to write about this experience, this relationship that in this book you call the maelstrom, um, from these two very different distances, and to describe it with enough detail and texture and context that like it makes total sense and you can access it and understand it if this is the first book of yours that you read, but it also doesn't feel like redundant to like, oh yeah, you said that already, right? As you read all your work. Um, and I'm just curious what that was like, just on a craft level of kind of revisiting an experience from
Yeah.
such a different kind of focal point.
Oh God, it's gonna be hard to be quick because it's such a
I know,
thread to
yeah.
such a big topic. But I think every memoirist is in some sense a little bit unwilling. Like I don't know that anyone's like, "Yay, I get to confront the worst thing that happened to me." Um, but I think a lot of us entertain the fantasy that once we write a book about something, we'll never have to write about it again. And of course, those of us who have written multiple books using personal narrative, we know that's not true. And I really, really hoped that I would never have to write about that relationship again. It was so complicated the first time. And uh, really, I think one of the hardest experiences of my life, if not the hardest. And when I first started writing The Dry Season, there wasn't much of it in there. I basically
Hmm.
just picked up and kept going. And then after I wrote the first draft, there was like a little bit, and it was very allegorical. And I gave the first draft to one of the characters in it, who I call Nora, who's one of my best friends. And there's a thread in the book where I describe her emotionally abusive relationship, which was very similar to the one that sort of initiated this process for me. And when I gave it to her, I gave it to her much earlier than I would normally give it to a reader because she was one of those deal breaker readers. Like if she was not comfortable with it, I would
Yeah.
not include it. And the note she gave me was so smart and so hard. And she said, "Look, I'm okay with you writing about my experience, but I'm not okay with you using it as a proxy for your own." And I was like, "Oh," because that's what I was doing.
Yeah.
I was you writing about her relationship in hopes. I didn't realize
As a
it, of
way to
course.
not have to talk about your own.
I didn't
Yeah.
want to have to revisit it. I didn't, and I felt just like, I mean, emotionally, I didn't want to have to revisit it, but also didn't want people to be like, "There she goes again, writing about her bad relationship," you know? Um, and she was just like, you can't avoid it. Like, if that's the grounds that from which this story began, like, you cannot leave it out and you cannot substitute it for someone else's. And I was like, so I went back and I included it, and I really sort of wrote about the state I was in and a little bit about the experience and about writing the inventory about her. And what I found when I wrote it was that it was so different, like the way I related to it. Because the first time I had written Abandon Me from inside of the relationship, like I started it when I was still in the relationship, and I basically sort of that book was the way I shoveled my way out. I
Mm.
sort of wrote my way out of it, and it was very immediate. And I was still all of the sort of fantasies and narratives I was telling myself are sort of in that book. And I wrote The Dry Season from 10 years distance. And, I was safe, right? Whatever I was struggling with in this book, I was not living in the sort of feral, frightened, lost place that I had been when I was writing Abandon Me and when I was in that relationship. And I was able to sort of handle it was just cool. The pieces were
Mm.
cool. They wouldn't burn anymore. And
Mm.
so I was able to sort of be generous in ways that I couldn't be in the first one. And I was able to be direct and honest in ways that I couldn't be in the first one too. So, I know that nobody wants to write more than one book about their worst relationship, but there are insights to be gathered if you do.
Yeah.
And I have learned, moreover, that if it comes knocking, you can't really turn it away. You have to, the only way out is through.
Yeah. One of those things like where do you feel it in your body that is like
Ah,
unfortunately,
it works. It
it's
works so
settled on it's
well.
true. Yeah. So
Oh,
thank
thank
you.
you, Lily.
Okay, all
These are
right.
such good questions.
I'll cut myself off here and open it up to everybody else. I'm sure folks in the audience have lots of questions. You can put them in the chat, and then I'll like pick out, maybe composite some of them if we get repeats, and ask them. Um, I guess maybe we should have like prompted people to do that.
Yeah, we can just talk more
While
if
we were
people don't
talking.
have questions,
Yeah.
but or I don't know if people can raise their hands to ask questions, if that's an option.
Yeah.
I'm also happy to talk about anything. It doesn't have to be about this book or what I read or anything about writing or writing as narrative medicine.
Yeah. Let's see. Starting to get a couple coming in here. Um,
Do you want to read them, Lily, or do you want me to?
sure, yeah, I can like pick out some good ones for you. Um, yeah, okay, that's a good question. It kind of relates, I guess, to the what we were just talking about, the last question of how do you access or approach memoir components from 10 years on, or I
Hmm.
guess a greater distance? What do you
Hmm.
look for in terms of blind spots that arrive with time? I guess kind of that
Hmm.
classic, like, what do you do?
Sure.
What do you if you don't remember all the details?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the thing. I think there's this sort of bias, I get a lot of students and writers asking me, like, is it okay if I write a memoir if I'm still young or if I haven't only experienced it recently? And I'm like, yes, if it feels right, do it. Also, you will have the greatest vividity of memories that you will ever have about that experience. So make use of them. And if you're not ready to write about it, take some notes. Um, this one, I wrote this from quite a distance. And there were definitely things that I forgot, but I will say I am a really avid journaler. I do morning pages almost every morning. And I also kept a specific journal when I was going through this experience because I wanted to remember it. And because, when I go through, uh, when I want to change, it often happens through writing because I just don't think very well in my head. It just kind of runs in a circle. So, in order for my thoughts to become linear and to get to a new thought, I have to externalize my thoughts. And I do that by writing or by
Hmm.
talking, but best by writing, I think. So, I did a lot of my thinking during that year in one document that I kept as a kind of record of that year. And I also had the inventory that I made and all the writing I did and all the emails that I sent to people. There was like a whole process that I sort of devised and underwent. And so I was able to sort of refer to that digital archive and to go back to my journals. And then I would say, I think a lot of it is stored in us too, that once you start plucking, things start to emerge and become clear. There were so many scenes and moments in this book that were not memories that I regularly referred to, but that came to me through the process of writing the book and reflecting and sort of sending myself back into that time. And maybe the most important thing I'll say for folks who are fret about this, as people do, like, what if I remember I forget the important part and then I leave it out? And to that I say, and I say this like with some fervency, I really believe this, that you have everything you need to write the book you need to write. There is no lost piece that would perfect it. That's not it, right? Like your psyche has the master plan for your book already. It's
Hmm.
just a matter of drawing it up into the conscious part of your mind. Like I really believe that it's been shown through all of my own work. And so if there are memories that you can't recover, you don't need those. Maybe you need to write about the fact that you can't recover them. Maybe you need to write into that emptiness, but I trust my psyche. If it keeps things from me, I don't need those things, right? I don't need them now. Maybe later I can have them, but um, I don't write a book out of what I don't have. I look at what I do have. The reader will never know what they are missing, and neither will you. That's really how it works. It's like, I mean, anyone who's ever written a book understands this because when I show you this book, you're like, whoa, 300 whole pages about your life. And in my mind, there is the map of the ghost 300 pages that I cut from it, and all of the experiences that I couldn't include, right? And so, it's a good sort of analogy, right? Your memory is just going to serve up the things that you need to articulate this experience. You don't need to find the ones that aren't there.
That's great. Yeah, that's such a great reminder. And this is okay, so this is one that I definitely want to pluck out because you've written so beautifully on this, and I'll say before you even answer that if you want the longer version of this answer from Melissa, you should go read Bodywork. But in the meantime, maybe the short event version. How do you work through shame when writing about hard things?
Oh, writing is how I work through shame. It really is. I mean, this is what I meant in the beginning when I talked about writing as a loving practice and a practice of love. I really believe that. And it was sort of reaffirmed for me when I learned all about the Beguines, who I write about in this book, where everything they did was an act of love. But shame is one of those hotspots. I think, anyone who has an artistic bent understands the urge to create. When you have the urge to write about something, it means there is something that could be created, right? I think that one of those urges in me is shame. It is, in
Mm.
fact, sort of my immune system response to shame is the urge to write, because writing is the way that I move through shame and the way that I integrate and liberate myself from shame, right? Because shame is a story about myself that I've internalized, right? And that I've then been reiterating to myself and sort of reifying, that's been shaping the way that I live and act and relate to other people. And it's like a disease. Um, and when I sit down to write about my experience, for me, autobiographical writing is a kind of truth serum, right? And the story that shame tells me is never the truth. It really isn't. It never is. It's always like some old, expired story that someone else told me about myself, or that I elsewhere absorbed. That never was true, and certainly isn't true now. And so as I'm putting sort of the pieces together, um, that I couldn't access when I was living, and maybe that my adult self can now sort of gift to that younger self, it I think it's an organic process of replacing the story of shame. It just
Mm.
happens every single time. It's one of the ways that I know when I'm done writing something, is that I don't feel that oily feeling anymore, that constricted feeling. I'm not afraid of being seen. My books are almost exclusively about things that I would have absolutely perished to imagine saying aloud to a group of people. By the time I finish writing the book, I literally go on tour reading to large groups of people about the very thing that was my worst secret. And it's not because I hate myself, it's because I have learned to love myself even more than I did before I wrote it, right? I think in a more pragmatic way, I don't do so alone. I do so with the help of dear friends, therapists, my wife, my family. Writing is always a community effort, but particularly this kind of writing, I think we cannot do it alone, you know? And I just have to be gentle. I can't like send myself into the coal mines. I have to take breaks when I need to. I have to get encouragement when I need to. I have to go back and like listen to my Tara Brock podcast episodes or whatever it is that will bring me back to myself. I can't force it. That would defeat the purpose, right? I'll just shut down if I try to force it. So I think
Mm.
by being gentle and loving and persistent and asking for help.
Mm. That's great. That's a way better answer to the, like, how do you know when you're done writing something than I've ever been able to come up with. I
It's
steal
true.
that.
When
That's really
when my
good.
content doesn't scare me anymore, and I'm like, I
Yeah.
want to go show this to people. That's how
Yeah.
I know.
That's great. Okay, there are a bunch more questions in the chat, but I'm just being mindful of the time, and I know I'm supposed to kick it back over to Janessa at some point. But I think that might be this point.
It is. I'm so heartbroken. But the beautiful thing is that we'll save the chat and we'll share all of these questions with Melissa because they are so incredibly thoughtful. So thank you for sharing them. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us tonight. Thank you so much, Melissa and Lily. What a beautiful conversation. We're really grateful for the space that was held. A recording of tonight's event will be shared later this week via email to all who registered. This formally concludes our 2025-2026 round season. We hope everyone has a beautiful summer, and we look forward to seeing you all in the fall and next spring. We'll see Lily again. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Janessa. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.